There's a small moment almost everyone has lived through. Your phone lights up, the exact name you'd been waiting weeks for. And you look at it, waiting for that familiar rush to come, nerves, self-pity, or at least something. But there's nothing, just a name on a screen. If you've ever lived through that moment, you've touched exactly what Stoicism was talking about 2,000 years ago. Not a way to make someone regret losing you, but a way that, one day, their regret, if it ever comes, no longer has the power to touch you at all. That might sound cold. It isn't. It's simply what happens after enough times of refusing to hand over the keys to your own emotions to someone who never knew how to hold them with care. Epictetus understood this better than anyone because he learned it the hardest way possible. He was a slave before becoming one of the most influential philosophers in history. He built what's still known today as the dichotomy of control. Life split into two simple parts, what lies in our hands and what never does. Our emotions, our reactions, our choices, ours. But whether someone remembers us, regrets losing us, or ever comes back, never was, and never will be, ours to hold. Most of us live the exact opposite of that, almost every day. One unanswered text, and the whole evening collapses. One cold remark, and we spend hours drafting and redrafting a message to explain ourselves, to prove we weren't wrong. But the more we explain, the more power we hand to the one holding the knife, because now they have an entire argument to fight back against. There's a very simple way to retrain that reflex. Next time someone hurts you with indifference, don't write a paragraph. Write one sentence, as short as possible. Then put the phone down, literally. Not to punish anyone, but to remind yourself that your feelings don't need anyone's validation to be real. No one can argue with a short sentence followed by silence. They can only sit with it, and for someone used to being begged after, that is the most uncomfortable thing in the world. But ceasing to explain yourself is only the first step. There's something far harder to let go of. The feeling that you have to fight for a place in someone's heart, try a little harder, do a little better, so that one day you'll finally be seen as you deserve. Seneca, who wrote much of the foundation of Roman Stoic thought, was exiled to the island of Corsica for 8 years over an accusation that even historians of his own time suspected was fabricated. 8 years with no power, no position, almost forgotten back in the capital. He could have spent those 8 years writing letters, begging to have his honor restored. He didn't. He wrote philosophy instead, not so someone would read it and feel sorry for him, but because he believed it was the right thing to do with the time he had, regardless of who ever acknowledged it. And ironically, it was precisely because he stopped begging that the court eventually invited him back. You may have never heard the name Seneca, but you almost certainly know the story of Abraham Lincoln, failed businesses, 2 lost elections, the death of the woman he loved, a collapse so severe his friends had to hide every knife in his house before he became one of the most respected presidents America has ever had. There was no playbook for impressing anyone after each fall. He simply kept reading, kept working, day after day, with no one watching the journey unfold and no one keeping score. And eventually, the very people who once overlooked him were the ones who came looking for him. There's something almost always true. The moment you stop fighting for a seat, the table tends to turn around and find you on its own, not because you performed it well, but because desperation and self-possession are 2 entirely different things, and people, even when they can't explain why, are always drawn toward the one who no longer needs them. But there's something even harder than simply letting go of the need for recognition, and that's letting go of the way someone else's mood controls your own. This is where most of us lose the battle every single day without even realizing it, because it happens so subtly in nothing more than a screen lighting up and going dark again. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, most of it in a cell smaller than 2 square meters. If anyone ever had reason enough to spend a lifetime waiting for his oppressors to repent, it was him. But when he walked out, he said that in those years he understood one thing: if he let hatred control him, he would still be a prisoner, just without the bars. That's exactly what Epictetus said 2,000 years earlier. The only difference is Mandela had to learn it through 27 years of his life. Here's a small practice for this. Before you let a text message or a silence decide how you feel for the next few hours, ask yourself exactly one question: is this really worth handing over control of my evening? Ask it enough times, and that question will slowly build a wall that no one can break through anymore. And once that wall starts to hold, something very natural happens. You get back time, you get back energy, the very things that used to be drained away by waiting and explaining. The question is what you do with what's left over. No one builds that wall after just one video. Lincoln didn't become resilient after reading a single book. Seneca didn't learn self-possession from one letter. It's always a process of returning, again and again, to the same few reminders, until it becomes reflex. If you want someone to remind you of this whenever you need it, the Stoic path will be here. Follow, so that next time you won't have to go looking for it. The video will find you exactly when you need it most. J.K. Rowling, before becoming one of the best-selling authors in history, had the manuscript for Harry Potter rejected by 12 publishers in a row. During that stretch, she was a single mother living on welfare, wheeling her daughter's stroller into cafes to write not for the cozy atmosphere, but because her apartment had no money for heat. No one was watching that journey. No one knew what she was scribbling in that worn-out notebook. She wasn't writing so that one day she could shove a published book in the faces of the 12 publishers who'd turned her down. She wrote because it was the one thing in her life still under her own control, not her circumstances, not her finances, not the rejection letters piling up just the page in front of her. That's exactly what Marcus Aurelius was doing, in a completely different world. He was the most powerful man in Rome, someone who could command an entire empire, yet every night, in the middle of endless military campaigns and a plague that killed millions during his own reign, he sat down and wrote for himself. Not speeches for the Senate, not decrees, just scattered thoughts, self-interrogation, reminders never meant for anyone else's eyes. That notebook only became known to the world after his death, almost 2,000 years later, and today it's called Meditations. A man who ruled the known world came to understand that the one thing truly his wasn't the throne. It was how he spoke to himself every night. There's something worth noticing in what a single mother writing in a cold cafe has in common with an emperor writing in a war camp. Neither of them had any idea what those pages would become. Rowling didn't know Harry Potter would sell over 500 million copies. Marcus Aurelius didn't know his private notebook would be read by millions of people 2,000 years after he wrote it for no one. Both of them were simply doing the one thing still within reach. At the exact moment, everything else had slipped out of their hands. A very small practice inspired by exactly that. Spend 10 minutes each night writing for yourself, not to post, not for anyone to read, not even to check the spelling. Just to look back on the day with the most honest eyes you can. It doesn't need an audience to matter. If an emperor once needed to do this in the middle of a collapsing empire, it's probably worth trying on one very ordinary evening of your own. But there's something harder to accept than everything said so far. Sometimes, even when you do everything right, people still don't come back. Not everyone who once oppressed Mandela ever bowed their head and apologized. Many of them died without ever speaking a word of remorse. Not every publisher who rejected Rowling ever publicly admitted their mistake. Most of them probably don't even remember holding that manuscript in their hands. And this is exactly where so many people stumble at the final step after doing everything else right. They stop explaining themselves. They stop fighting for a place at the table. They stop letting someone else's mood control their own. But somewhere underneath, one clause remains unsigned. A private belief that if they're good enough, calm enough, patient enough, the universe will eventually balance the scales, that the other person will finally see it, finally regret it, finally come back with an apology worthy of what they lost. That's no longer begging out loud. It's begging in disguise, wearing the mask of composure. Marcus Aurelius understood this trap better than most, because he lived inside it himself, not in matters of the heart, but in ruling an empire riddled with betrayal, where even those he trusted most turned against him. He wrote that people will act according to their own nature and their own limits, and that expecting otherwise makes as much sense as being angry at a tree for bearing bitter fruit. The goal, for him, was never to make anyone regret losing you. The goal was to become someone for whom their regret, whether it ever comes or not, no longer has the power to shake anything inside you. Not because you've gone numb, but because your peace no longer needs anyone's confirmation to exist. Back to that phone lighting up at the start, the exact name you'd been waiting weeks for. If one day you look at it and feel nothing in particular, not because you've gone numb, but because you've become whole without them, that isn't a sign you've lost something. It's a sign you've just found the one thing that mattered most. If anything in this made you pause for even a second, type 3 words in the comments. I choose peace, or swap the last word for whatever you're choosing for yourself right now. No explanation needed. Sometimes 3 words are enough.